On a quiet street one sunny morning, a little girl stood beside her pink bicycle with a cardboard sign that read, "For sale." When a man in a dark suit stopped to ask why, her answer changed everything. "Buy my bike, sir. Mommy needs money for food." That simple plea would awaken a truth the man had buried long ago and begin a story of forgiveness, love, and second chances. Before we begin, I just want to thank you truly for being here and for listening with your heart. May peace, health, and kindness always find their way to your home. Now tell me, my friend, from which country and at what time are you listening to this story tonight? The sky over Portland carried that quiet silver light that comes before spring truly wakes up. Morning fog rolled gently between the trees, softening every sound, turning the whole city into a watercolor dream. Along the narrow paths of Laurelhurst Park, joggers moved like shadows, and the ducks glided across the pond. Among them, a little girl stood beside a faded pink bicycle, her small hands clutching a cardboard sign written in uneven letters, "For sale. Mommy needs food." Her name was Lila Jensen, 7 years old, wearing a second-hand red coat and sneakers that were too big for her feet. The breeze tugged at her hair as she fixed the sign again, carefully making sure the words could be seen by people walking their dogs. Most passed her by without a word, some with polite smiles, others with the silent unease of not knowing what to say to a child who spoke the truth too plainly. At that same moment, a black Tesla eased to a stop near the curb. Behind the tinted glass sat Ethan Calloway, a man in his mid-30s whose face rarely betrayed emotion. His company's name, Calloway Systems, was embossed in gold on the sleek briefcase beside him. He had just finished a call with his legal team, his voice firm, distant, efficient. When he hung up, his gaze drifted out the window and caught the small figure by the park entrance. For reasons he couldn't explain, he slowed the car. There was something about the little girl, maybe the way she held herself, or the courage it took to stand there with a sign that said what adults often couldn't. He parked, stepped out, and the morning air felt unusually sharp. "Hi there," he said, his tone softer than usual. "That's a nice bike you've got." Lila looked up, her voice small but steady. "It's for sale. Mommy hasn't eaten in 2 days." The sentence struck him like a quiet blow. Ethan glanced at the bike, scratched, the paint chipped, but the bell still shiny. "How much are you asking?" She hesitated, thinking hard, then shrugged. "Whatever helps Mommy buy dinner." He took out his wallet and handed her 3 crisp $100 bills. "I'll take it," he said simply. She blinked, surprised, as if no one had ever said yes that quickly. Ethan guided the bike to his car, folded the sign carefully, and set it beside the seat. Lila waved goodbye with both hands. As he drove away, the fog began to lift, revealing the bright green of the park's early spring grass. But the image of the girl stayed in his mind longer than it should have. Her calm honesty, her little hands holding that cardboard sign, it all settled into a place in him he didn't know still existed. Back at his office, everything returned to routine. Polished floors, quiet computers, a world run on precision and profit. Yet something about the morning felt heavier. He placed the folded sign on his desk. The words, "Mommy needs food," stared back at him as if waiting for an answer. He tried to ignore it, but that night, long after the city lights had dimmed, he found himself unable to sleep. The silence of his penthouse was so deep it almost echoed. He poured himself a glass of wine, walked toward the wide windows overlooking Portland's skyline, and for once, the view didn't comfort him. Somewhere out there, a little girl had just sold her bike so her mother could eat. Somewhere, the world kept spinning without noticing. He set the glass down and whispered into the empty room. What kind of world needs a child to do that? The city outside was quiet, except for a distant sound, maybe a bell, maybe the hum of a late train crossing the bridge. Ethan stood there, feeling a strange pull in his chest, an unfamiliar warmth mixed with regret. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, simple, almost invisible, would be the beginning of everything that changed his life. He tried reading the quarterly report, but the numbers blurred into a gray haze. Around midnight, he closed the laptop and stepped out onto the balcony. The city stretched beneath him, bridges, streetlights, the quiet pulse of distant traffic. In the windows of nearby buildings, he could see warm rectangles of yellow light, where other people still talked, laughed, or sat beside someone they loved. For years, he'd convinced himself he didn't need any of that. Solitude had become his discipline, success his armor. Yet tonight, the silence of his penthouse felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. On the counter lay the folded cardboard sign. He picked it up again, tracing the uneven letters with his thumb. For sale. Mommy needs food. Each word seemed to carry the weight of something pure and impossible childish honesty in a world that preferred to look away. He glanced at the pink bicycle leaning near the glass door. Under the bright apartment light, it looked even smaller, a fragile thing lost among steel and glass. The handle grips were worn smooth, the seat patched with tape. A faint smell of wet grass clung to it, carrying with it the memory of the park. He imagined the girl's little hands holding the handlebars, her voice steady but tired. Ethan sat on the couch, staring at the bicycle until the city lights began to blur. For the first time in years, he thought of his mother the way she used to hum while mopping the diner floor. The scent of cheap soap, the pride in her face when he'd bought her a car after his first big contract. He'd buried those memories under ambition, telling himself he was moving forward. Now they rose like ghosts, asking questions he didn't want to answer. What kind of world needed a child to sell her bike for food? And what kind of man could drive away and do nothing? He ran a hand through his hair and sighed. Maybe he would call the HR department tomorrow. Maybe he'd ask about that name, Jensen. But the thought of it made his chest tighten with something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to guilt. Outside, fog drifted low over the streets, wrapping the city in quiet silver. He turned off the lights and stood by the window, the faint reflection of the pink bicycle hovering beside his own. Somewhere out there, the little girl was probably asleep, dreaming of something better. The city was hushed, yet in that silence he could almost hear her voice again, soft, matter of fact, echoing through the dark like a prayer. Mommy needs food. Ethan closed his eyes, and the sound followed him into sleep, a whisper that refused to fade. Morning crept in quietly, pulling the fog back from the river and letting the city breathe again. Ethan Calloway sat in his office long before anyone else arrived, the skyline of Portland still half asleep behind the glass. The pink bicycle leaned against the far wall like an accusation, a splash of color in a world that had forgotten softness. He hadn't planned to bring it, but when he left home, the thought of leaving it there felt wrong, as if it might disappear and take the memory of the girl with it. Now, it stood under the sterile office light, beside framed awards and the company motto etched in glass. Efficiency is everything. Ethan stared at that phrase for a long while, the words suddenly hollow. He'd built this company from nothing: code, logic, and relentless precision. And yet, all it had taken was a child's cardboard sign to make him question the system he'd built. He pressed the intercom. "Dana, when you get in, bring me the termination logs from last quarter, especially anyone named Jensen." The HR director, Dana Crowell, arrived half an hour later, balancing her coffee and a stack of papers. She was one of the few people who dared to look him in the eye. "That's a pretty specific request," she said, setting the folder down. "Something happened?" "Just bring it," he replied. As she left, his reflection in the glass caught his attention: sharp suit, tired eyes, the kind of man who never ran out of control but had long run out of peace. He turned away before the thought could stay. When Dana returned, she placed the file in front of him. "Clara Jensen," she said, tapping the folder. "Accounting department. Terminated 6 weeks ago. The system flagged her file for misreporting funds." Ethan opened the document. Inside were lines of numbers, a summary report, and a red stamp that read, "Fraudulent activity. Who authorized this?" "Technically you did," she said gently. "It was automated through our audit algorithm. But I looked into it after you called. It wasn't fraud. The system misread a transfer she processed to cover medical expenses for another employee. She was actually trying to fix a payroll error." Ethan's jaw tightened. "So she was fired for doing the right thing?" Dana hesitated. "In a way, yes." The words hit harder than he expected. He leaned back, letting silence fill the room. For years, he'd taken pride in the clean efficiency of his operations. No room for emotion, no space for mistakes. But sitting there, staring at that file, he felt the edges of something sharp pressing against the inside of his chest. "Do we have her address?" he asked. Dana nodded. "It's in Selwood, but Ethan, what are you planning to do?" He closed the folder. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe see what the system broke. When she left, he turned toward the window again. Below, traffic flowed like a slow-moving current, orderly, obedient, predictable, the kind of world he'd always wanted. But now, all he could think about was a little girl standing in the cold, offering her bike to strangers so her mother could eat. He rubbed his temples, the echo of her voice whispering through memory. "Mommy needs food." The phrase no longer sounded like a plea, it sounded like an indictment. As noon sunlight cut through the clouds, Ethan rose from his chair, took his coat, and walked past the rows of cubicles. His employees nodded politely as he passed, unaware that something inside their boss had already begun to fracture. He didn't take the company car that afternoon. He wanted to drive himself, wanted to see the city not from behind tinted glass, but through open air, the way ordinary people did. The road to Selwood ran along the Willamette River, winding through old bridges and tree-lined streets. It was quieter here, softer. Houses stood close together, porches filled with flower pots and bicycles, real ones that children still rode. As he stopped at a light, Ethan caught a glimpse of a mother and daughter crossing the street hand in hand. For a second, he thought he saw Lila's face in the crowd, but it was just another child with a pink backpack. The resemblance, though, made his heart beat faster. He pulled over, took out the folder again, and read the name, Clara Jensen. The name felt heavier now, not just an entry in a database, but a story his system had erased. He started the engine again, the afternoon light flickering through the trees, and headed toward Selwood, not knowing what he would say when he found her. The Selwood neighborhood looked nothing like the sleek heart of downtown Portland. Here, the houses leaned close together, painted in soft colors that had faded kindly with time. Wind chimes tinkled on porches. Someone's dog barked lazily behind a fence. Ethan slowed his car near a row of modest apartments, unsure what he was looking for until he saw a second-floor balcony with a line of tiny plastic flowers and a child's jacket hanging over the rail. He parked, turned off the engine, and just sat there. For a man used to walking into boardrooms full of investors, it was strange how hard it felt to open a simple car door. He had 1,000 speeches, ready explanations, apologies, but none seemed right for a woman he'd never met. Finally, he stepped out, carrying the folder like it might protect him. The stairway creaked beneath his shoes, each sound louder than the last. When he reached the door, marked 2B, he could hear faint music from inside, something old, maybe a lullaby. He knocked twice. The door opened a few inches. A woman appeared, her face pale from exhaustion but striking in its quiet strength. She looked at him the way someone looks at a storm, measuring whether to close the window or face it. "Miss Jensen?" he asked. "Yes." Her voice was cautious. "What do you want?" He held out the envelope he'd brought.
"I came to return something that was never supposed to be taken from you."
She frowned. "Excuse me?" Ethan hesitated. "I run Callaway Systems. You worked there." Her expression hardened instantly. "So, now you're here to make yourself feel better?" "It isn't that," he said quieter. "I looked into your file. You were fired because the system made a mistake." "I told them that," she replied. "No one listened." She started to close the door. "I'm listening now." For a moment, the world seemed to stop at that half-open door, the smell of rain, the hum of traffic far below, the space between guilt and forgiveness. Then she said, "Listening doesn't change anything. My daughter still had to sell her bike so we could eat." The words landed heavier than he could bear. He nodded once, stepped back, and set the envelope on the floor. "It's not payment," he said softly. "It's acknowledgement." Clara looked at him for a long beat before closing the door, but not completely. It stayed cracked, an inch of shadow and light between them. Ethan turned and walked down the stairs. Outside, the sky had begun to darken again, the kind of Portland evening that smelled of rain and second chances. He paused beside his car, watching the windows of the apartment glow faintly above. Through one of them, a small silhouette moved a little girl holding what looked like a picture book, Lila. He leaned against the car and drew a slow breath. Everything in his life had been about fixing problems, optimizing outcomes, erasing flaws. But standing there, he realized that what was broken this time wasn't in any system he could rewrite, it was in him. He looked up once more at the flicker of light behind the curtains, then whispered to no one, "Maybe she's right." And as the first drops of rain began to fall, he climbed into the car, the sound of the girl's voice still echoing somewhere in the back of his mind. Gentle, steady, unforgettable "Mommy needs food." Rain swept across Portland through most of the night, washing the streets clean and leaving a soft shine on the sidewalks by morning. Ethan Calloway drove aimlessly for a while before heading back to Selwood, not because he had a plan, but because he couldn't forget that half-closed door. The apartment building looked different in daylight, less worn, almost dignified in its resilience. He parked under a maple tree dripping with water and sat watching the windows. Somewhere up there, a mother was packing lunches she could barely afford, and a little girl was probably asking if it would stop raining soon. He thought about walking away, about letting the moment fade like every other uncomfortable truth he'd encountered in life. But something in him resisted. Maybe it was that small voice from the park. Or maybe it was the look on Clara Jensen's face when she'd said listening doesn't change anything. By late afternoon, the rain had eased to a mist. Ethan stepped out of the car, clutching a brown paper bag he'd filled at a corner market, some groceries, a few things for a child, nothing extravagant. The wooden stairs creaked under his weight as he climbed again to the second floor. He knocked once, then again. The door opened just enough for Clara to appear. She wore a gray sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back loosely. There was a pause before recognition settled in her eyes. "Mr. Calloway," she said flatly. "Didn't we already talk?" "I know," he answered, "but I didn't say everything I meant to." He held up the bag. "These are just groceries, nothing more." Her jaw tightened. "You don't have to do this." "Maybe not," he said, "but I should." For a moment, she looked as if she might close the door again, then sighed and stepped aside just enough for him to set the bag on a small table near the entrance. The apartment smelled faintly of soap and coffee. A single lamp filled the room with golden light. He noticed coloring books on the couch, one open to a page half finished in pink and blue. "Is your daughter here?" he asked gently. "She's napping." Clara's tone softened a little. "She shouldn't have talked to strangers in the park. I told her that." "She wasn't wrong to," he said. "Sometimes strangers notice what the world ignores." Clara folded her arms, uncertain whether to be touched or angry. "You think money fixes guilt?" He shook his head. "If it did, I'd have been forgiven a long time ago." They stood there in silence, the sound of dripping water from the roof marking the seconds. He turned to leave, but as he reached the doorway, she spoke again, quieter this time. "Why does this matter to you?" He hesitated. "Because I fired a good person for trusting the wrong system, and because your daughter reminded me what kindness looks like." Clara looked down, her eyes glistening, though she tried to hide it. "You should go, Mr. Calloway." He nodded. "All right, but if you ever need help finding work again, call me directly." He pulled a card from his coat pocket, set it on the table, and stepped out. When the door clicked behind him, he waited for the sound of the lock turning. It didn't. The door remained slightly ajar, just enough for a line of warm light to spill into the dim hallway. Outside, evening settled over the city, the streets shimmering under wet reflections. Ethan stood for a while beneath the awning, feeling the drizzle on his face. For the first time in years, he didn't rush to be anywhere. He simply stood there, listening to the rain, to his thoughts, to the quiet hum of a world still moving even when it hurt. And behind him, in that small apartment, the door stayed half open, as if forgiveness itself was deciding whether to step out into the night. Ethan didn't drive home right away. He stopped by a small diner at the corner of Tacoma Street, the kind with fogged windows and a bell that jingled every time someone came in. He took a seat at the counter, ordered a cup of black coffee, and sat watching raindrops slide down the glass. The waitress, a woman about his mother's age, refilled his cup twice without asking. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said kindly. "Maybe I have," he replied, half smiling. "Ghosts are usually people we forgot to say sorry to." She winked and moved on, leaving him with more truth than comfort. He stayed until the rain stopped. Outside, puddles shimmered under the streetlights, the world smelling faintly of wet asphalt and hope. He thought again of Clara's apartment, the yellow light spilling into the hall, the coloring books, the sound of a child sleeping in the next room. A simple home, but more alive than anything he owned. By the time he reached his car, the decision was already forming. He would help them, even if it meant doing so quietly. He'd made a mess through indifference. He would start cleaning it with care. Over the next few days, Ethan found reasons to return to Selwood. He told himself it was about logistics, verifying her employment record, preparing compensation, but deep down he knew it wasn't only that. He wanted to see proof that they were okay. From a distance, he watched Lila walk to school, her little backpack bouncing as she ran. She always looked for her mother's wave before crossing the street. One morning, he left a grocery bag at the door again. Bread, fruit, a box of crayons tucked between the cans. No note this time. When he came back that evening, the bag was gone. At the office, Dana noticed the change in him. He stopped interrupting people in meetings, asked about their families, listened. "You're acting human again," she joked. Ethan just smiled and said, trying to remember how. A week passed before he saw Clara again. It was late afternoon, the light turning golden through the maples. She was walking home from the bus stop, carrying a paper bag of groceries. He slowed his car and rolled the window down. "Miss Jensen," he called gently. She turned, wary but less angry than before. "Mr. Calloway, I just wanted to make sure you're doing all right. We're fine." Then, after a pause, she added, "You don't have to keep helping us." "Maybe I don't," he said, "but I want to." For the first time, she didn't argue. Her expression softened, almost weary. "You can't fix what your system broke," she said quietly. "I know," he replied, "but I can try to make sure it doesn't break anyone else." She nodded, unsure what to say, then started toward her building. Halfway up the stairs, she stopped and looked back. "Thank you for the groceries." He smiled. "You're welcome." The evening light caught her hair as she disappeared inside. He waited for the sound of the door closing, but instead, it stayed slightly open again. Just as before, halfway between mistrust and possibility, Ethan stood there for a long time, the hum of the city fading into the background. Somewhere behind that door, a small girl was probably drawing with her new crayons, and a mother was trying to believe that some people really could change. He didn't know if forgiveness would ever come, but he knew this much. For the first time in years, he wanted to deserve it, and when he finally drove away, the last thing he saw in his mirror was that same thin line of light spilling from her apartment into the evening, the door still half open. Saturday mornings had always been the quietest part of Ethan's week. Normally, he'd spend them scrolling through reports or reviewing contracts while his coffee cooled beside him. But this time, he found himself sitting in his car outside Maple and Steam, a small cafe just down the street from Clara's apartment building. The place smelled of cinnamon and roasted beans, its window fogged by the early autumn chill. Inside, locals gathered over muffins and newspapers, their laughter mixing with the clatter of dishes. It was the kind of scene he rarely noticed before the small, ordinary warmth of people who belonged somewhere. Clara was there too. He spotted her near the window, a paperback open in one hand, the other wrapped around a mug. She looked different out of the apartment, her shoulders relaxed, her expression softer. There was a faint tiredness in her eyes, but also quiet determination. Ethan stood for a long moment at the door, unsure if he should enter. He didn't want to intrude, yet something in him needed to speak with her beyond the polite exchanges at her door. He finally stepped in, ordered black coffee, and walked toward her table. She looked up when he approached. Her surprise was genuine, but not hostile. "Mr. Calloway," she said, closing her book. "You do realize there's a whole city of cafes, right?" He smiled faintly. "Seems I keep ending up where the good people are." Her lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Sit down if you want, but I'm not signing any papers." "I didn't bring any," he said, easing into the chair across from her. "Just a question." She raised an eyebrow. "Only one?" He nodded. "Why didn't you appeal the termination? You could have fought it." Clara stirred her coffee slowly, eyes on the swirling cream. "You ever been so tired you just stopped fighting?" she asked. "I called, I emailed, I begged someone to check the records. No one cared. After a while, I decided my energy belonged to keeping Lila fed, not proving a system wrong." Her words hit him harder than he expected. "You were right," he said quietly. "The system failed. I failed." For a long moment, they both just sat there, the cafe noise fading around them. Then Clara sighed, folding her hands. "You know what I keep thinking about? Lila's bike. She loved that thing. I told her we couldn't keep it, and she said, 'It's okay, Mommy.' Maybe someone else needs it more." "I didn't realize that someone would be the man who caused our problems." Ethan's throat tightened. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "I know," she said softly. "Intentions aren't the same as actions, Mr. Calloway. But you're here now. That counts for something. Yeah. The conversation paused when the waitress came by to refill their cups. Outside, rain began again, soft, rhythmic, like an old hymn. When the waitress left, Clara looked up. You ever wonder what forgiveness really is? He thought for a moment. Maybe it's not forgetting, he said. Maybe it's deciding not to close the door all the way. Clara blinked, surprised by the echo of her own actions. For the first time, her smile reached her eyes. Careful, she said. You might start sounding like a decent human being. Working on it, he replied, smiling too. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was gentle, almost comfortable, like a space both of them needed. For a brief moment, it felt as though time had slowed, as if the world had allowed them to breathe again. And then, from behind the counter, a small voice piped up bright and familiar. Mommy. Both turned. There was Lila, skipping in from the back of the cafe, holding a paper cup of milk. Her eyes widened when she saw Ethan. Hey, you're the man who bought my bike. Clara froze, unsure how to respond. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his voice soft and steady. That's right, Lila, and I still have it. Safe and sound. Her face lit up like the first morning sun after rain. Really? You didn't sell it? No, he said, smiling. It's waiting for you. The little girl gasped, hands to her mouth in disbelief. Mommy, can we go see it someday? Clara looked from her daughter to Ethan, caught between gratitude and hesitation. We'll see, she said carefully. Finish your milk first. But Lila was already chatting about pink ribbons and flower baskets. Ethan listened quietly, feeling the weight in his chest lift a little. For the first time, the sound of her laughter didn't sting, it healed. Outside, the rain cleared, leaving sunlight streaming across the cafe windows. And though neither of them said it aloud, both knew something had shifted the first real thaw between guilt and forgiveness. Lila talked the way sunlight fills a room completely, without permission but never unwelcome. She told Ethan about school, her favorite teacher, the cat that lived behind their building, and how her mom made the best pancakes in the world even without enough syrup. Ethan listened, nodding, smiling where he could, letting the rhythm of her words wash over him. It had been so long since anyone spoke to him with such open joy. No filters, no calculation, just a child's faith that people were worth talking to. Clara watched the exchange quietly. There was a tenderness in her eyes she didn't bother to hide anymore. She talks too much when she's excited, she murmured. I don't mind, Ethan said softly. It's been a while since anyone told me about their cat. Clara laughed a real laugh this time and shook her head. You're impossible. He took a slow sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. You're different when you laugh, he said, almost to himself. Like the whole room changes. Her smile faltered a little, caught between surprise and something else, fear, maybe, or hope she didn't dare name. She reached across the table to gather Lila's napkin, keeping her hands busy. Don't say things like that, Mr. Calloway. People start expecting you to mean them. Ethan, he corrected gently. If I'm going to mean things, you might as well call me Ethan. For a long second, she said nothing. Then, almost reluctantly, all right, Ethan. The sound of her voice, using his name, felt like a window opening somewhere inside him. They sat there for nearly an hour, talking about small things, school lunches, job searches, Portland traffic, the rain that never seemed to stop. And somehow, beneath all the ordinary words, something extraordinary began to form. Trust. When they finally stepped outside, the air was crisp and clean after the storm. Lila skipped ahead, splashing in puddles while Ethan and Clara lingered by the door. Thank you, she said suddenly, for not giving up when I told you to go away. He smiled. Thank you for not locking the door. Clara looked up at him, her eyes warm and steady. Maybe some doors aren't meant to stay closed. Before he could reply, Lila shouted from a few feet away, Mommy, Ethan, come see. They turned. She was crouched near the edge of the sidewalk, pointing at something beside a puddle. It was a small pink ribbon, wet, frayed, but unmistakable. The same kind that once fluttered from her bicycle handlebars. Clara's breath caught. That's from your old bike, she whispered. Ethan stepped forward slowly, crouching beside the ribbon. It must have fallen when I moved it to the garage, he said. I guess it found its way back. Lila picked it up carefully, her little fingers trembling with delight.
It's a sign,
she said matter-of-factly.
It wants to come home.
Clara looked at Ethan then. Something unspoken passing between them, an understanding that maybe second chances didn't always arrive with warning, but sometimes with a bit of pink ribbon carried home by the wind. Ethan smiled faintly. Then maybe we should listen. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds just long enough to cast a warm light across all three of them, man, woman, and child standing there on the wet pavement, a single ribbon linking past and present. And as Lila skipped ahead again, humming a tune only she knew, Clara turned toward Ethan with quiet wonder. "Do you believe in signs?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his voice low but sure. "I didn't. Until today, somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to chime, and though neither of them said it aloud, both knew something had begun, something that would not stop at simple forgiveness. For several weeks, Ethan's life moved in two parallel rhythms. By day, he was still the CEO, the one who spoke in numbers, policies, and schedules. But by night, when the offices went dark and the city lights flickered on, he drove back to Selwood. He never stayed long. Sometimes he dropped off a bag of groceries, other times envelopes with job listings or information about local programs. He left them quietly, never signing his name. Yet somehow Clara always knew they were from him. The visits became their unspoken language, a rhythm of giving and receiving that neither dared to call friendship, but both secretly needed. One chilly Thursday, as autumn deepened, Clara invited him in for coffee instead of letting him leave the bag by the door. He hesitated, then followed her inside. The apartment felt warmer than before, a few new books stacked on the shelf, Lila's drawings taped along the wall, a child's world built with crayons and courage. "Lila's at school," Clara said, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs.
You don't have to keep doing this, you know.
"I'm not sure I could stop if I tried," he said with a faint smile. She handed him a mug and sat opposite. The steam fogged her glasses for a moment. "You ever get tired of fixing things?" Ethan chuckled softly. "That depends. Some things stay broken no matter how much you try." Clara studied him, her voice gentle but firm.
And some things heal when you stop trying to control them.
He nodded, letting the thought settle. For a while they sat in easy silence, listening to the rain tapping the windows, the same sound that had followed them since the day they met. Finally, Clara reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. "I kept meaning to give this back." Inside was the money, the $300 he'd given Lila for the bike. Ethan frowned. "Clara, no, I mean it," she said. "You gave that out of guilt, and guilt doesn't belong in our home." He looked at her, then slowly pushed the envelope back toward her. "Maybe I gave it out of guilt then," he said softly. "But now it's something else. Call it gratitude for reminding me what being human feels like." She didn't argue this time. Her eyes softened, and for a brief second, Ethan caught a glimpse of something fragile but real forgiveness, still forming but no longer impossible. When he left that evening, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glazed in gold. He walked slower than usual, breathing in the scent of wet leaves and distant coffee. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man running from his past. But peace is fragile. It never stays still for long. 2 days later, Dana called from the office with news that made his heart tighten. "Ethan, we have an issue with the board," she said over the phone. "They flagged irregularities in your discretionary spending, charity donations, small transfers, things you've authorized personally. They think you're using company funds for private interests." He froze. "It's nothing major, but they're asking for an audit. They want explanations." His mind raced. He'd kept every transaction small, covered in legitimate paperwork, the donations he'd made under Clara's name, the food drives, the new school supplies for the local center where Lila went. But in a company built on cold efficiency, compassion looked suspicious. "I'll handle it," he said finally, his voice tight. After he hung up, he stood at his office window, watching the rain return like an old habit. It struck him that good intentions carry their own kind of weight, the kind that didn't crush you all at once, but slowly bent you toward truth. That night, he didn't go to Selwood. The pink bicycle in his garage stood untouched, its ribbon still missing, its bell quiet. He poured himself a drink and sat in silence, wondering how easily one man could undo what little redemption he'd found. For the next few days, Ethan felt the pressure closing in. The board demanded reports, numbers, explanations. Each question was a reminder of how far he'd drifted from the person he once pretended to be, the man who worshipped efficiency, who believed emotions were flaws in a system designed for profit. Now, every dollar he'd spent helping Clara and Lila stood like an accusation. Every act of compassion was being weighed as misconduct. Dana knocked on his office door one evening after everyone had gone. She didn't wait for permission to enter. She just walked in, holding a folder. "They're serious," she said quietly. "They think you've lost perspective." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Maybe I finally found it." Dana sighed, setting the file down. "Look, Ethan, I know you. Whatever this is about, it isn't greed. But the board doesn't care about motives, only margins." He rubbed his temples. "I'll take responsibility." Responsibility for what? For being human?" She paused, her voice softening. "You've built something good here, Ethan. Don't burn it down trying to save one family." He looked up sharply. "It's not about saving them. It's about saving myself." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Dana didn't argue. She just nodded, as if understanding more than she was willing to admit, and left him alone with the rain that had started again outside. That night, he drove to Selwood. The streets glistened, and the river shimmered faintly under the streetlights. Clara's window was lit a soft glow behind pale curtains. He parked across the street, not sure why he'd come. Maybe he wanted to warn her, or maybe he just needed to see proof that something in his life still made sense. He hesitated for a long time before knocking. Clara opened the door, her hair damp from washing dishes, her sweater sleeves pushed up. "Ethan," she said, surprised. "It's late." "Oh, I know," he replied. "Can we talk?" She stepped aside. Of course. Lila was asleep on the couch, curled beneath a blanket decorated with cartoon stars. Ethan looked at her for a moment, the rise and fall of her small breaths reminding him why this mattered. Clara poured him tea instead of coffee chamomile, warm and calming. "What happened?" she asked. He hesitated, then told her everything: the board, the audit, the accusations. How trying to help her might cost him everything he'd built. When he finished, she stared at him in quiet disbelief. "You did all that for us?" He shook his head. "Not for you. Because of you. You and Lila reminded me there's more to success than profit margins." She looked down, her hands clasped tightly around her mug. "Ethan, you can't lose everything because of me." "I've already lost worse," he said softly. "Years of my life that meant nothing. For a moment, she said nothing, and the room filled with the small sounds of the night, the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft rain against the glass. Then she reached across the table, her hand resting briefly over his. "Maybe some things are worth losing if they make you whole again." Her touch was light, but it carried more weight than any contract he'd ever signed. He looked up, their eyes meeting, a fragile, wordless understanding forming between them. Then, from the couch, Lila stirred. Her sleepy voice drifted through the quiet room. "Mommy, is he staying for breakfast?" Ethan smiled gently, his heart tightening at the innocence in her tone. Clara hesitated, then glanced back at him. "Maybe," she said softly. "If he wants to." He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd like that." Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, the kind that promised another long night of rain. But inside, for the first time, the air felt warm, alive, safe. And as Lila drifted back to sleep, Ethan realized that the storm waiting at the office no longer scared him. The only thing that frightened him now was the thought of losing the light he'd found in this small apartment. A light that made even his mistakes worth something. He stayed until dawn, listening to the rain soften into silence. When morning came, Portland was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving streets glittering with puddles that mirrored the pale blue sky. Sunlight spilled through Clara's small kitchen window, catching steam from a pot of coffee that filled the air with comfort. Ethan sat at the table, still in yesterday's shirt, hands wrapped around a mug she had pressed into them before he could protest. Across from him, Clara moved quietly between the stove and the counter, her hair damp, her movements unhurried. Lila sat on the floor, half awake, feeding cereal to a stuffed rabbit that had clearly seen better days. It felt, impossibly, like home. No one spoke for a while. The sounds were small but complete, the spoon clinking against the mug, the creak of the old chair, the faint hum of traffic outside. Ethan found himself memorizing it all, as if storing proof that peace could exist in moments as ordinary as this. "Lila, eat your cereal before it turns to mush," Clara said gently. "I'm sharing," Lila replied, holding a spoon toward the rabbit. Ethan smiled. "He's a lucky one." Lila grinned at him. "His name's Mr. Whiskers." "Well, Mr. Whiskers looks like he had quite a breakfast." Clara rolled her eyes, but the warmth in her smile betrayed her amusement. For a few blessed minutes, it was easy to forget everything waiting beyond those walls, the audit, the board, the thousand things that could unravel the fragile world they were building. When Clara finally sat down, she looked at him quietly. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I mean, not like last night." He hesitated. "Do you want me to go?" She didn't answer right away. "I just don't want you to make promises you'll regret." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Clara, the only regret I've ever had is realizing too late what mattered." Her gaze held his for a moment, and something gentle passed between them, a quiet acceptance. Not romantic yet, but deeply human. Two people trying, after so many mistakes, to believe in good again. The spell broke when his phone buzzed on the table. The screen flashed Dana Crowell. He almost ignored it, but Clara nodded toward it. "You should take it." He stepped onto the balcony, where sunlight fell across the damp railing. "Dana," he said. Her voice was urgent. "Ethan, the board's moving faster than expected. They've called an emergency session this afternoon. They're preparing to suspend you pending investigation." His stomach sank. "Already?" "They're saying your donations crossed legal limits, and one of the recipients they're linking it to an employee you fired." He closed his eyes. "Clara Jensen." "Yes," she said softly. "I'm sorry, Ethan. You should get ahead of this before it turns ugly." He hung up and leaned against the railing. Below, the neighborhood children were riding bicycles along the wet street, their laughter rising like birds. The sunlight made their wheels gleam as they spun through puddles. One of the bikes had pink ribbons fluttering from its handles, catching the light. He felt the world slow. All the noise, all the fear, it didn't matter, not compared to the small voices laughing in the sundae. When he stepped back inside, Clara was washing dishes, her back turned. "Bad news?" she asked quietly. "They're suspending me." She froze. "Because of us?" "Because of me," he said. "Because I stopped pretending compassion was inefficient." She dried her hands, turned, and looked at him for a long time. "What will you do?" He smiled faintly. "Something I should have done years ago." "Which is?" "Tell the truth." The words hung between them, simple, but heavy enough to fill the room. He looked down at Lila, who was now humming to her rabbit, the sound small and bright like hope. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue. "Lila," he said, kneeling beside her, "I think this belongs to you." She unwrapped it slowly and gasped. Inside was the pink ribbon he'd found near the puddle outside the cafe. Her eyes shone. "You kept it?" "Of course," he said softly. "Some things deserve to find their way home." She hugged him tightly around the neck. "Don't let the bad people take you away, okay?" His throat tightened. "I'll try my best." The rest of that morning unfolded like a slow goodbye. Ethan stayed long enough to help wash the dishes and tie Lila's shoelaces before school. When she left, she turned back once, waving her small hand. "Don't forget breakfast next time," she called out, laughing. He smiled, but the sound of the apartment door closing behind her lingered longer than he expected. Clara poured another cup of coffee and sat across from him. "You're really going to face them, aren't you?" "I have to," he said. "I spent years building a system that measured success by how much we could take, not how much we could give. Maybe losing it is the only way to fix it." She studied him quietly. "You think they'll listen?" He gave a tired smile. "Probably not. But maybe someone watching will." The drive downtown felt heavier than usual. The city seemed sharper somehow, the honking cars, the flashing lights, the steady hum of a world that never looked up long enough to care. When he reached the Callaway Systems building, the sleek glass facade reflected the sky so perfectly it almost erased the clouds. Inside, the boardroom was already full. Dana was there, her expression tight, standing beside a stack of papers. Across the table sat the board members, 7 of them, polished and precise, like statues carved from judgment itself. Mr. Calloway, the chairman began, his tone clipped. We've reviewed your recent transactions. While we appreciate your philanthropy, using company funds without full authorization is a violation of protocol. Ethan stood at the far end of the table, hands steady. Then maybe the protocol needs to change. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. The chairman adjusted his glasses.
You misunderstand. This isn't a discussion about morality. It's about procedure.
Then that's exactly the problem, Ethan said quietly. We built a company that punishes kindness because it doesn't fit inside a spreadsheet. Dana met his eyes, something like pride flickering behind her worry. One of the younger board members leaned forward. You risked everything for one terminated employee. Why? Ethan took a breath. Because the system failed her. Because she had a child who believed strangers could be good. Because for the first time, I didn't want to be the kind of man who proved her wrong. Ugh. The words hung in the air, heavier than silence. The chairman frowned. You understand that this defense borders on sentimentality. Investors won't accept that. Ethan smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time we stopped working for people who've forgotten what decency looks like. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the chairman closed his folder. Effective immediately. You are relieved of your position pending review. We'll contact you once the decision is final. He nodded once, quietly. That's fair. As he turned to leave, Dana caught his arm.
Ethan, what will you do now?
He looked back toward the glass walls, where sunlight poured through like forgiveness. I'm not sure, he said, but I know where I'm going first. He walked out of the building, down the polished steps, and into the open air. The sky was clear now, the last traces of rain drying on the pavement. When he reached his car, he took a long breath and looked toward the east, toward Selwood, toward the small apartment where a pink ribbon waited in a little girl's hands. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he might lose. He was thinking about who he might become. And as he started the engine, the sunlight caught his windshield in a flash of gold, the same color as forgiveness. The days that followed were quieter than Ethan expected. For the first time in years, his calendar was empty. No meetings, no phone calls, no reminders blinking on the screen. The silence inside his penthouse was so vast, it almost felt like a living thing. He wandered from room to room past the gleaming counters, the framed certificates, the polished glass that reflected a man he no longer recognized. The place looked impressive, but without purpose, it was just square footage. That afternoon, he packed a few things into a single duffel bag: clothes, a book his mother once gave him, and the pink bicycle bell that had somehow become a kind of compass. He left everything else behind. By evening, he was standing in front of a small cottage just outside Selwood, a weathered rental with ivy crawling up the porch and a creaky mailbox that leaned like it had stories to tell. He'd found it through a neighbor's recommendation, cheap, small, and perfect. The landlord, a cheerful retiree named Marjorie, handed him the keys with a grin. Needs some fixing, but she's got heart, she said. Most folks just want shiny things these days. You don't look like most folks. Ethan smiled faintly. Not anymore. He spent the next 2 days cleaning, scrubbing years of dust and neglect away. The work was simple, grounding each sweep of the broom, each hammered nail a quiet act of rebuilding not just a house, but himself. On the third morning, he bought a table and 2 mismatched chairs from a thrift store. He placed them by the window where sunlight pooled in long, lazy stripes. Then he walked to the local market and picked up groceries, not the imported kind his assistant used to order, but bread, eggs, fruit, and a small carton of milk that reminded him of childhood. When he returned, there was a knock on the door. He opened it to find Clara and Lila standing there. Lila was holding a tiny pot with a daisy barely blooming. "Mommy said we should bring something for your new place," she said proudly. Ethan crouched down, smiling. "It's perfect. Thank you." Clara glanced around the small space, her eyes softening. "You really did it," she said quietly. "You left everything behind." He shrugged. "Turns out everything I owned didn't own me back." She laughed, the sound light and tired at once.
"How's unemployment treating you?"
"Peaceful," he said. "Strange, but peaceful." She set a small paper bag on the table. "Dinner." Lila insisted we cook enough for 3. The little girl beamed. "I made the mashed potatoes." They ate together as the evening light filtered through the windows, painting the walls gold. The conversation was easy, small things, shared stories, quiet laughter. Lila talked about school, about a class pet turtle named Speedy who didn't move much. After dinner, while Clara washed the dishes, Lila wandered to the corner where the bicycle bell sat on a shelf. She picked it up and gave it a soft ding. "It still works," she said, her voice full of wonder. Ethan nodded. "It always did. It just needed a reason to ring again." When Clara came over to say they should leave, Lila tugged at her sleeve. "Can we visit again?" Clara smiled. "Maybe, sweetheart." Ethan looked at both of them, something tender in his expression. "You're both welcome any time." They lingered at the door for a moment. The air smelled of pine and distant rain, and fireflies had begun to shimmer above the grass. As they walked down the path, Lila turned back and waved. "Good night, Mr. Ethan." He stood on the porch long after they disappeared from sight, the sound of her voice echoing softly in the stillness. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone in an empty house. He felt at home in one that had room for others. And on the table by the window, the daisy Lila had brought leaned gently toward the last light of day. The next few weeks slipped by quietly. Ethan's cottage filled with the rhythm of small human things, the squeak of the screen door, the hum of an old refrigerator, the laughter that sometimes drifted across the fence from neighborhood children. Life no longer ran on deadlines. It breathed instead. Clara and Lila began visiting often. Sometimes they stayed for dinner, sometimes just long enough to bring pie or stories from their day. The three of them built a kind of routine that didn't need to be named. One afternoon, Lila arrived carrying a folder of construction paper drawings. She spread them across the table, explaining each one with the seriousness of an artist. "This one's Mommy, this one's you, and that's our house." Ethan smiled at the third picture. It was a crooked little cottage with 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow sundae. "You gave me the biggest smile," he said. "Because you laugh the loudest," she replied simply. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway, her expression soft. "You really do, you know." He looked up at her. "Guess I finally found something worth laughing about." That evening, Clara lingered after Lila fell asleep on the couch. The fire crackled low, casting a warm glow across the room. "She's been happier lately," Clara said quietly. "I think seeing you reminds her that people can change." Ethan turned the cup in his hands. "She's not the only one learning that." They sat in silence for a while. Then Clara asked, "What are you going to do now? With your life, I mean." He thought for a long time. Maybe build something smaller, something that helps instead of measures. There's a community center downtown. They need someone to set up computer programs for local families. "I was thinking about volunteering." Clara's smile widened, touched with pride. "That sounds exactly right. Would you help me?" he asked. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "If you bring the coffee." He laughed softly. "Deal." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, thin flakes melting against the windows. Quiet and slow. They stood together watching it drift. And somewhere between the falling white and the orange flicker of the fire, something wordless passed between them. Not a confession, not yet, but understanding. A week later, the old Callaway Systems building released a press statement announcing Ethan's resignation and his decision to fund community outreach programs with his remaining shares. The newspapers called it a surprising act of humility from one of Portland's most private executives. Ethan didn't read them. He was too busy repainting the community center walls while Lila covered her hands in blue paint, leaving prints like tiny constellations along the hallway. That night, Clara brought him dinner and stood beside him, looking at the prints. "She said they're stars," she whispered. He nodded. "Then I guess this place will always have its own sky." She leaned against the wall, her voice softer. "You really changed everything." "No," he said, smiling. "You just reminded me how." The two of them stood there, the room filled with laughter and color and the smell of fresh paint. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city that had once been only noise and steel. Now it was softer, almost merciful. And when they finally walked home, Lila between them holding both their hands, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since childhood belonging. He looked up at the sky and whispered, almost to himself, "So this is what home feels like." And Clara squeezed his hand gently. "It was never the walls, Ethan," she said. "It was the people who waited inside." He smiled, his breath visible in the cold air. the three of them moving through the snow like a promise kept. Spring arrived gently that year, as if the city itself was learning to breathe again. The rain that had once fallen endlessly over Portland now came softer, warmer, and kinder. On the edge of Selwood, the small community center Ethan had helped rebuild was alive with color and sound, children laughing, volunteers painting walls, the smell of coffee and fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. It wasn't a grand place, not compared to the glass towers he used to command, but for Ethan, it was more precious than anything he had ever owned. Every wall carried a fingerprint of hope, every sound a reminder that he had finally found a reason to stay. He spent his mornings teaching basic computer skills to seniors who'd never touched a keyboard before, his afternoons fixing donated laptops for kids who needed them for school. Clara often came by after work, sleeves rolled up, sorting supplies or helping in the food pantry. Lila's laughter echoed down the hallway as she drew stars on the chalkboard or helped arrange books on the shelves. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the bridge and the river turned gold, Ethan stood outside the center, wiping paint from his hands. Clara joined him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. The air smelled of wet grass and new beginnings. "She looks happy," Ethan said, nodding toward Lila, who was chasing bubbles near the fence. "She is," Clara replied softly. "She thinks this place is magic." He smiled. "Maybe she's right." Clara tilted her head, studying him. "You've changed more than this building, you know." He looked out at the sunset. "Maybe I just remembered who I used to be." For a long moment, they stood in silence, 2 people who had learned that healing doesn't happen in grand gestures, but in small, steady acts of kindness. The wind stirred the chimes above the doorway, their soft ringing blending with the laughter of children. Inside, the lights began to flicker on, one by one. Warm, golden, ordinary. Ethan turned to Clara, his voice low and thoughtful. "You ever think about how light works?" She smiled. "How do you mean?" "It doesn't choose where to shine," he said. "It just does. Whether it's a mansion or a small place like this, light doesn't care. It just keeps going." Clara looked at him for a long time, and in that quiet gaze was every answer he needed. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Ethan locked up the center and stepped into the cool air. The street was quiet, the sky deep and full of stars. Across the river, the city lights shimmered the same city that had once felt too big, too cold. Now, it looked almost tender. He walked toward his cottage, the one with the ivy on the porch, where a small daisy still grew in the window, the one Lila had planted months ago. Through the window, he could see them. Clara setting the table, Lila humming while arranging forks, the glow of home spilling gently into the night. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, letting the scene fill him with something wordless and full gratitude, perhaps, or quiet awe. Then he opened the door. Lila looked up and beamed. "You're just in time. We saved you the last piece of pie." He laughed, shaking off his coat. "Then it must be my lucky night." Clara poured him coffee, the same way she had that first evening months ago, and for a while, they ate together without words, only the soft music of dishes, the creak of the old wooden floor, and the kind of silence that feels like belonging. After dinner, when Lila had fallen asleep on the couch, Ethan stood by the window. Outside, the streetlight glowed faintly through the mist, steady, patient, constant. Clara joined him, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" He nodded. "Yes, it reminds me of something my mother used to say." "What's that?" He smiled faintly. "That every heart is a light. Some just take longer to find their way home." Clara slipped her hand into his fingers, intertwining naturally, like something that had been waiting to happen all along. The night deepened, quiet and kind. Somewhere in the distance, a train's low whistle drifted through the air, the sound of time moving forward. And as they stood there beneath that soft, unwavering glow, Ethan realized that redemption had never been about undoing the past. It was about loving what remained and choosing, again and again, to keep the light burning. He turned to Clara, his voice gentle but sure. "You know what I think?" "What?" she asked. "I think this is the happiest I've ever been." She smiled, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. "Then don't let it fade." And he looked toward the lamp outside, its glow reflecting in the window pane. "It won't," he said. Not this time. Outside, the night settled softly around them, quiet, forgiving, endless, and the last light in the window stayed on, steady against the dark. Sometimes, the most beautiful endings don't happen with applause. They happen quietly, around a small dinner table, with the smell of coffee and laughter filling the room. After all the storms he'd faced, Ethan didn't rebuild his life with money or power, but with patience, forgiveness, and love. The house that once echoed with emptiness was now full of warmth, a mother, a child, and a man who had finally learned what home truly meant. If this story touched your heart, press 1 the comments. If you think we could tell it better next time, press 0. Your voice matters, because stories like this one live on only when they remind us that compassion still has a place in this world. Unconditional kindness can change a destiny. Everyone deserves to be loved, forgiven, and welcomed home. True happiness doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from giving, from listening, and from daring to love again after loss. It's a little like the porch light many of us still leave on at night, glowing quietly, waiting for someone to find their way back. Maybe that light isn't just for others. Maybe it's for us too, a reminder that even when life grows dim, we can still be someone's way home. I'm reminded of Sunday suppers in small American towns, the kind where families gather around pot roast and mashed potatoes, where stories are told slowly, and forgiveness is served alongside dessert. In those moments, time seems to pause, and you realize that love was never about perfection, but about showing up again and again with an open heart. So tonight, wherever you are sitting by your window or watching the sun fade beyond the porch, take a moment to think of those who once opened their door for you, or those waiting for you to knock again. If this story warmed your heart, share it with someone who could use a little light too. Because sometimes it only takes a single spark of kindness to brighten an entire lifetime.